Care 101, what you need to know to protect your family. And it's hosted through the University of Illinois at the State Water Survey and the Water Resources Center. The private well class is an EPA-funded program through the Rural Community Assistance Partnership. Together, we've set up these webinars, and we have a class, which I'll mention in a little bit, along with a lot of other materials for private well owners. So I'm just going to get started. We had a lot of folks register in the last couple of days, and when you registered, it allowed you to ask questions that we will try to answer. Unfortunately, we had 100 people register just since yesterday, and we likely won't get to some of those questions. And I'll talk about that more when we get down to the end. But there were a lot of questions this time, so bear with us. Okay. So again, this is part of a national program with RCAP that the University of Illinois has put together. These materials follow our private well class program, and that website is privatewellclass.org. This webinar is being recorded, and we've already had a number of folks email us and say they couldn't get on for one reason or another, or had another commitment come up. It will be on our website, on our webinars page in a week or two, and so you'll be able to watch the whole thing or pieces of it if you prefer then. And as it says here at the bottom, we will have time at the end for some follow-up questions. Katie Hollenbeck and Jennifer Wilson from the Water Resources Center are on to facilitate those questions. There's a place on your GoToWebinar screen where you can ask questions. Please do. And also today we have Dan Webb and Chuck Curtis from the State Water Survey's chemistry group. Here, they're both chemists and work in our labs and have a lot of knowledge about chemistry that I don't. And so they're very valuable to a lot of the questions that get answered are those two gentlemen. So thanks for joining us, you guys. Today we're going to talk about the basics of well care, ensuring your water is safe to drink, and then some maintenance best practices. We'll spend a lot more time on questions than we will going through the 20 slides or so I put together. Again, we've received a bunch of questions from everyone, so bear with us as we go through that. I already mentioned Jennifer Wilson and Katie Hollenbeck from the Water Resources Center, and Dan and Chuck, who will help us answer the questions at the end as well. So a few things to remember: private wells aren't regulated. So it's up to you as a well owner and a user to be sure your water is safe to drink and the system's maintained. No one's going to do that for you. And water, well water especially, can be the best tasting and safest in the world, but if it has contaminants, those can be colorless, odorless, and have no taste, which means a lot of times when people see water that's colored or has a smell, they assume there's something wrong. Many times that's natural, and there is no health issue where water that may look perfectly fine and clear actually may have some kinds of contaminants in it. So I grew up on a dug well, 14-foot well, 4-foot diameter, hand dug well. Now I live in Champaign, Urbana, Illinois, and I pay $40 or $50 a month to my community water system. And that's the cost spread out over our 150,000 residents for sampling the water, making sure it's safe, all the maintenance on the pipes and the system, all the treatment that's added, and all the infrastructure that's in place to ensure that when I turn on my tap, I have safe, clean water. And as a well owner, this is your responsibility. First, we'll talk about some well considerations. It all starts with your well. In general, a deeper well is better, only from the standpoint that it is more protected from surface influences. That's not always the case. And if it's not properly constructed, then all bets are off in that regard. But also your location in the landscape, if it's a shallow well, and many are around the country, the groundwater flow direction has an influence based on what's upstream, so to speak, or up gradient versus down gradient, and also the things you do around your well that might allow things to infiltrate in the ground near your well. So when we say deeper is generally better, one of the reasons that's not the case in some cases is when they're naturally occurring contaminants at depth, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit. But going back to well construction, the first thing is poor well construction. Now, most states, except Alaska and Pennsylvania, have well construction codes and regulate their drillers so that you're assured that when a driller installs a well, it's done to a certain standard that will protect it at the surface, all those sorts of things. Those codes have been written mostly in the last 20 to 30 years. In some cases, they're more enforced in some states than others in some areas, but any well that's more than 20 or 30 years old may have construction standards or no standards at all when it was installed that may make it less protective of any kind of contamination from the surface. The well I grew up on, water could run in through uncemented brick. These wells were all grandfathered in Illinois when the code was changed. You couldn't have someone put a well in like the one I grew up on today, but if you're still using it, it's considered your responsibility. And also, wells in pits. Years ago, before the invention of the pitless adapter, wells were put in pits in colder climates so that the pipes wouldn't freeze in the winter. And so if you had your well down below the frost line, then you were assured that there would be no freezing pipes. Those pits, many are still in existence today as well. And if you have a well like that or a hand-dug well, they're just not as safe. And a pit allows water to pool in the pit. They're also a safety hazard just from walking over them, all those sorts of things. So there are, again, two problems with that. It provides an opportunity for surface contamination that sits around the well. In some cases, a pit can get flooded, almost like if a creek got out of its banks and flooded a whole area or all the low ground. And so they're really a safety hazard in that respect as well. Here's two examples. The well on the left is from in Washington State. It's from their blog. Their Department of Ecology is their agency that regulates drillers and well construction code. And so when they have an instance of a problem, and I'll show several from them, they highlight that to let people know hey, this is what's going on. There's a jet pump here at the surface. That plywood that was sitting over top of the well finally broke through. The person who that it killed probably walked over that plywood 100 times or more, and it was never a problem. Finally, it gave way. And so it's just an unsafe situation. Mice can fall in, rats, you name it. And so it's just not a way to have your well if you're trying to protect yourself from contamination or bacteria and those sorts of things. The well on the right is an old hand-dug well. You can see the home up on the upper right, up over the hill. And yeah, it's covered with 2x10s and 2x8s and tin and blocks. There's no way that keeps insects or rats or other kinds of rodents. This is a cattle pasture. There's actually cattle in this pasture. We took this picture. Walt Kelly's my boss here at the Water Survey. We were doing some sampling. Cattle are rubbing up against those posts. They're, using that area. It's just certainly not a safe way to have your well. So what should you do with these wells? The best thing to do would be bring them up to code. And I say that, I know people get a little gun shy, if you will, when you start talking about regulations and those sorts of things. But if you talk to your state agency that regulates well construction, or online in most cases, you can find what the codes say as far as what's protective. You should use clay grout around the well, all those sorts of things, and they're there to protect you. And so even if the state isn't involved, you call a local driller and ask them you want to raise that pipe up to the surface, fill it in with clay grout, all the things that you need to do. Again, the point of this is if your well isn't properly constructed and it's not safe in a way that near surface contaminants might be able to run down the well bore on the outside to get into your well, or your well's in a low place, or you're storing things that are dangerous, all those things matter. And so construction is the first place where you can do a lot to help protect the water quality in your well. Here's another couple examples. The two figures on the left are both from, again, Washington State Department of Ecology, and the two figures, or the four headlines on the right, are all from the 90s, and three of those are from Illinois. Uh-oh. I've got a timer set and I forgot to change it. Okay, so the point being, even in Illinois, there's Galesburg and Buffalo Grove and Springfield, the bottom one. The third one there is Jessica McClure, when she got caught in a well and it was captured on CNN for 18 hours in Texas. But the other three all happened in Illinois, and all of these are local or very regional papers. And I guarantee you the people in Galesburg didn't know about the one in Buffalo Grove, and the one in Buffalo Grove didn't know about the one that died in Springfield. For some reason, it doesn't make national headlines or even state headlines, but it happens a lot more frequently than you would care to believe. And so if you have an old dug well, or you have an abandoned well, the one that Jessica McClure fell in was only, I believe, a 16-inch or 12-inch well, they should be sealed. And that's both to protect from a safety issue, also to protect the aquifer. A rodent falls down in there, or somebody sees this nice 12-inch pipe sticking up thinking, oh, that's a good place to dispose of something. And it's not. It puts it right in the aquifer, and it can contaminate other wells. So as far as best practices, just a general best management practice is to always use a licensed driller, pump installer, or contractor. They use approved equipment. They've got experience. They understand the geology in your area. And it's important to make sure that this is a big investment. You see people who put in sand points or try to put in their own well, and that depends on the state. But in Illinois, as a landowner, you have the legal right to install your own well on your property. It's just something we wouldn't recommend. Leave it to the professionals. Make sure it's safe. It's the water that your family is going to be drinking, and make sure it's done right. As far as the well site, one thing you can do, you should always inspect your well regularly. Make sure that the vent has a screen on it so things can't crawl in. It should be elevated, like this example. This is about 18 inches above land surface. And it should, usually it's mounted, or you need to ensure that the casing has the soil around it is all up against it such that there aren't gaps, so that when it rains, things can flow down along the outside of the well casing. Also, the well should be accessible, and that point is if your pump is in your well, especially if you have a submersible, you plant a couple trees near it. 10 years from now, they may be too big for a rig to get in there, or you may run lines or have something else going on, or you may put your well in a position that the only way to get to it is to drive a rig over your septic field, which is also a bad practice. So make sure it's accessible, and that nothing's wrong with the casing. It's a simple thing to do, to go out and inspect that, make sure the bolts are still there, the vent is on, all those things. This is from the Minnesota Department of Health, and I use this example mainly because it's a very complete list of setback requirements. Now these numbers, the 35 and the 50 feet, and like septic or holding tank at 50 feet, those are Minnesota's rules. They may not be Delaware's rules or Pennsylvania's rule or some other state's rules, but the idea, we show this in our class too, is to give you an idea of all the things that may impact your well, some things you may not have considered. And so putting your well in a certain location is really something that needs to be done with some forethought. Also, especially to your septic and other things that might go in the ground near your well. So this is the top half of this figure, but and here's the bottom half. And going back to this, as an example, here it says lake, stream, or pond, 35 feet. I had a well owner in New York contact me and said that he had some green stuff in his filter. He took it and had it tested. It turned out to be algae. He goes, "Can you have algae in your well?" And per se, know in general. It's a surface water issue, but it turns out with a little investigation and talking to him, his well is in fractured rock, which is at the surface, and it's 11 feet from the lake where his well is. So he's basically got a direct conduit from his well to the lake, and when he pumps his well, he's pulling in lake water, and so that's why the algae have developed in his system. So it all matters. As I said, every state or most states have a handbook or a set of rules on wells, well construction, materials you should use, all those things. A licensed driller will use those materials and follow those rules because their license depends on it, but it's a good idea to understand how your well is constructed, or again, if your well was put in before some of these rules went in place, understand what the differences are and what kind of risks might be associated with that. Because we certainly see a lot of problems with these older wells or wells that weren't properly constructed just because of those reasons. Another thing to really be conscious of is your septic system, both your drain field and your tank. And there's an example of a 2-compartment tank. You know, this is a wastewater treatment system. So all the waste from your home is going into this system. It's a natural process that breaks things down, and but like your well and everything else, it needs to be managed. Eventually, solids build up in your tank if you don't pump your tank regularly based on the amount of use you have. Eventually, the tank's going to get full. Solids will either plug the drain field, or get into the drain pipe and eventually start plugging that stuff up. When that happens, it's a bad thing. If it gets completely plugged, all of a sudden you may have septic running back into your house. That's the worst case. Or it may be, instead of leaching down from your drain field, it ends up causing a pond in your backyard of this really nasty, very rich material. So we have a whole entire webinar just on septic system issues, and it's been recorded. If you want to learn more about that, we're not going to cover that all today. But yeah, it's important to maintain your septic system and understand how it works, what things you should and shouldn't put in your down your toilet or your sink, and all those issues. As far as a to-do list for your septic system, the bottom one I'll start with: pump your tank on a regular schedule. Your tank will fill up with solids eventually. If you don't pump those solids out, eventually it'll fail. So things that are bad are, to maintain the area, I mentioned earlier, not driving a well rig over your septic field. You don't want to do anything to compact the soil there so that all the microbes and the natural aeration that happens in normal soil can happen. You certainly shouldn't put concrete over it or asphalt. Going back to wells, we've seen wells that are, we ask the well owner where their well is, and they're like, oh, well, we decided to cut it off below grade, and we put our garage there. So now there's no access to their well whatsoever. You need to leave things open so they can be dealt with. And related to a septic system, there's an inspection port and a manhole on your tank. Those need to be accessible so you can see how much solid is in there if you have your tank inspected, and there's a manhole so that you can get it cleaned out. They work based on the bacteria from our bodies that get in there and basically start a colony, and they break things down. More flow means they have less time to do their job. So you shouldn't have your sump pump run into your septic or your whirlpool or even your softener backwash. And I know there's some discrepancy about how effective that softener backwash might be, but it also contains chlorides, and it's just from the standpoint of reducing total flow to your septic, it's a good idea not to have that connected to your septic system. Also, if you have a garbage disposal, those are very bad. Matter of fact, NESE, the National Environmental Services Center, has a chart that you can look at that shows how often you need to pump your tank depending on the number of people and the size of the tank. And they suggest that if you have a garbage disposal, you basically cut that time in half. And that's because, all those vegetables and, solid pieces, the bacteria can't break those down as readily, and they end up being solids in the bottom of your tank. So, and it just makes sense. No man-made stuff. Paints, pills, those things. Amoxicillin kills bacteria. So you put your extra stuff down your toilet and flush it, you're affecting the bacteria in your septic tank. So just all common sense practices. If you have questions about your septic, you can contact us or contact a local septic installer, inspector, or your county health department. And they can certainly, in many states, it's the county health department that inspect the septic systems when they go in and ensure they're put in properly and the setbacks are right and all that stuff. So they should have expertise there. Testing. You should test your well annually, and then anytime the well's been opened, or if there's any noticeable change of any kind or any kind of concern, there's a smell, there's an odor, or you just had to have your pump replaced. Anything like that can cause a breach, so to speak, that bacteria might get in the well, or something left over from some pump work or well work. And so the best thing to do is to have a sample collected and be sure. So what do you test for? It's a really good question. It really depends on where you're at, how deep your well is, the formation your water's coming from, and if there are known contaminants in the area. If you're right next to a gas station, you just move in, you might want to consider at least asking any of your neighbors if they've tested, those sorts of things. Your county health department or your state, either health department, Department of Environmental Quality, DNR, all those groups that work with understanding groundwater and wells and geology, your state geological survey, in Illinois also the state water survey. If someone in Illinois calls me and says, do we have arsenic in our area? I can tell them. And there are folks in every state who have that information, who have worked in those areas, mapped the aquifers to know where they're at, and done water quality analysis to understand what naturally occurring contaminants especially might be in an area. And so you really need to contact your county first or your state health department. I know our health department contacts us whenever they have questions because of our lab that Dan runs and a lot of the sample analysis that we've done over the years. Also, talk to your neighbors, extension. There are a lot of folks out there who have your best interests and may have some information to help you. Sample annually for coliform and nitrate. Those aren't necessarily a health risk, especially, coliform itself isn't a health contaminant, but E. coli is. But what coliform tells you is that there's a pathway into your well. You should not have coliform in your well, so if you do, there's some sort of pathway there from the surface in all likelihood, and you need to try to figure out what is going on. And that's just kind of an indicator then that you may be at more risk of other things getting in your well. Here's what we suggest in our class. Again, coliform and nitrate annually, and then initially and every 3 to 5 years, this other list here, depending on if you have galvanized piping. I just learned recently that in some states, like in Virginia, they allow the actual well pipe to be galvanized piping. And so that causes other issues depending on how corrosive the water might be for zinc, cadmium, or lead. And so understanding your well construction also dictates, and the piping in your home. If you have copper piping, corrosive water can cause some more leaching than you'd have and other types of water. And it sounds counterintuitive, but softened water is more corrosive. And Dan or Chuck can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure that's right. And so when you're running a softener, those things can have an effect. But as always, what we recommend is talk to your local health department in the area or your state health department. They may have other issues that you need to be concerned with and that we might not have here or in some areas of the country. Oh, I skipped. I thought I was going somewhere else here. For example, the state of Rhode Island has beryllium throughout almost the entire state. And until I saw that on their website, I didn't even realize beryllium was a regulated contaminant, but it is. It's got an MCL, it has health effects, and if you're a resident of Rhode Island, There's a large portion of Rhode Island where they recommend you test for beryllium if you have a private well, just because it exists there where it may not in many other parts of the country. As far as interpreting your results, when you get test results back, there are websites out there that can give you an idea of whether it's over an MCL and things like that, and some of them are pretty handy. We recommend in our class we show one of those sites. It's put together by Penn State Extension, but always then, no matter what that says, take your results to your health department and get a qualified answer from an environmental health professional. That's their job. They've been trained. And if they don't have an answer for you, they know where to get the answer. And working locally is always better just because they probably have more experience with your local conditions. We get calls all the time and folks wanting help with either their analysis or they have an issue, excuse me. And what we end up doing is going back and then calling their state or their county and talking to somebody local there to get a better answer and understand their situation. And so they're always the best folks to go to. That's who we go to too. And if you do have E. coli, or if you do have coliform bacteria, then you just shouldn't drink your water. You should boil it until you can get an E. coli test, and then you can get your well chlorinated, or you're going to add treatment. That way you're protected. That's just a safe thing to do. As far as treatment goes, these are just two examples of the process of reverse osmosis and what your softener does on the right here, on the left here. If you have any kind of treatment, a softener, filter, RO, anything else, make sure that you have a maintenance and a replacement schedule and you understand how those things work and be strict about following it. Because I've had several health professionals ask me not to include treatment in our class. Their experience with well owners has been someone gets treatment, they eventually kind of forget about it or don't think it's that important and they let it go. They don't change the filter, they don't replace the media or do whatever they need to do. And just like an RO unit, an RO takes out many things and it's a great treatment device. But the cartridge, if you don't take care of it, stops working, everything goes past it, and it can also be then kind of a breeding ground for bacteria. So it can actually introduce more problems if it's not maintained properly. And so if you already have treatment or you're considering treatment, make sure you understand all those issues. It's not buy it once in most cases and it's done. It's you're replacing cartridges or a filter or whatever. And you need to understand what the actual cost might be as well as what your responsibilities are to make sure you maintain it properly. Who to talk to? Again, we stress talk to your local health department for anything related to your well as far as your drinking water quality, whether there's any kind of health risk. They either can correct your problem and explain what treatment you might need, or they can direct you to the right person to do that. Also, your lab, if you use a certified lab, which is what we would recommend, EPA certified lab, they should be able to give you information or at least send you down the right road to find suggestions for treatment if you need it. And also be informed, there's information on our website about trusted sources. Treatment is a big business. We hear all the time cases where folks have added treatment that maybe later they went and talked to their health department and found they didn't really need. And so being informed is your best defense against those sorts of issues, and understanding how it works and what things it's supposed to remove. And there are usually alternatives. And when I say consider alternatives before deciding, it may be that you can drill in another well is in your best interests over the long haul, or even hooking up to city water. And I mean, those are extreme examples, but usually there's alternatives, and make sure that you understand those before you commit to any one, especially expensive choice. So to kind of sum up this part of the webinar, as a well owner, it's a significant responsibility and especially an investment, so protect it. Wells right now in California are costing well over $25,000 to put in. And so in a lot of places in the country, they're not that expensive, but generally over 10, and as much as 40 or 50, depending on how deep you have to go and the type of well. So understanding how it works and maintaining and keeping it safe and making sure that nothing happens that makes your well unusable is certainly worth the time and effort. How that will best be served, if you will, is for you to be more informed as a well owner so that you understand what maintenance you need to do, what proper care you need to take care of. Keeping records. There's a lot of other best practices that we mentioned in our class so that, something happens, you know who to call, how to take care of it, if what the situation is you have. Like growing up, our well had a pump on at the surface, and we had heat tapes around the pipes for the winter. I grew up in central Illinois, where we'd have at least a few days every winter that are below zero. But if our power went out, which it did, we were in a very rural area, our pipes would freeze unless we kept that building warm. So we had a propane heater that we had on hand that we could put down there just to keep things warm so that our pipes didn't freeze and burst. You see a lot of that in some areas. So understanding the issues and then relying on the professionals in your area. So many people tell us, well, I didn't call the health department. I was afraid if I found something in my well, they're going to tell me I can't use it anymore. Well, there are a couple counties in the country, and they're on the East Coast. I'm not sure which ones. I need to find that out, where they actually require sampling to ensure they meet the Safe Drinking Water Act, like a community water supply would have to, but nowhere else. New Jersey has a law that says you have to have a well sampled by the state at the sale of property if it has a well, but if you're on your own well, it's completely up to you. And so you should look at your health department and other professionals, like at your DNR and DEQ and Geological Survey and those folks, as professionals who offer unbiased advice, and they've got your best interests at heart. And it's good to get to know those folks. Or an Extension, I forgot to mention Extension. Their job is to raise awareness of all these issues, just like mine is, and you should rely on those people. Again, sample annually, and then lastly here, PwC is private well class. Sign up for the lessons. They're a lot more detailed than we can provide in a webinar like today. They walk through a lot of things that are beneficial to you as a well owner. So getting to the questions, and I'm not sure if I need to unmute Dan and Chuck, or we can wait till we get to a question where they're going to be involved here. But as I mentioned earlier, we took most of the questions we received as of late last week, and we're going to go through most of those now. But if there are a few of those that we won't answer, I sent them out actually to an expert on some other that we don't have. And so, I was taught as an engineer a long time ago, I don't have to have every answer. I have to know how to get every answer. And I use that a lot in this class because there's a lot of things to understand about private wells. And my experience is mostly on the source water side and sampling and water quality side. So some of the more technical things about pumps and some of those things I send out to people who know a lot more than I do. So there's some questions we won't answer, but one thing I want to mention is with the funding we received from RCAP and US EPA, we've started building basically an FAQ page, a frequently asked questions page, that we will eventually have every question that's been asked. Some will be obviously combined. We get some of the same questions every time, but and I said 6 months or so, hopefully sooner, but it'll be searchable and filtered so that it'll be easy for you to find a question related to, iron bacteria, or how do I disinfect a well, or whatever, and at least send you to resources that describe those things in more detail and can increase your knowledge of that subject. So with that, I want to mention that Chuck Curtis and Dan Webb and Walt Kelly, all from the State Water Survey, helped answer the questions that they provided the answers to many of them actually, that we're going to go through now today. And I'm probably going to read the questions and answers, and then if Dan and Chuck want to expand on anything, feel free. Okay, so what are unsafe levels of nitrate for children or animals, and how do we lower them? So the drinking water standard, which is what the EPA sets for community water supplies, is 10 milligrams per liter. And that's really there to protect infants. Babies under a certain age, usually considered, I think, 1, don't have the acid in their stomach to properly break down nitrate, and so it can form nitrite, which gets in their bloodstream and replaces oxygen and causes blue baby syndrome is what it's called. It's got a bigger name that I don't know, but as far as animals, we have no idea. A vet should be able to tell you that, and Dan and Chuck suggested that RO is probably the best treatment option. Anything else to say there, guys?
Hey, Steve, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yeah, very well.
The one thing I would point out is to make sure that everybody understands that 10 milligrams per liter is expressed as nitrogen. Sometimes you'll get some of the quick test kits, or it can be lab analysis too. We'll express it as nitrate, which might seem like the first common sense way to interpret it, but all these regulations are expressed by converting the nitrate to what they call just the nitrogen component of it. So it's 10 milligrams per liter of nitrogen is the same as 45 milligrams per liter as nitrate. So they have to be careful about how you interpret results.
Great. Okay, so what are unsafe levels of ammonia? Well, there's no drinking water standard for ammonia, but Chuck found on EPA, I think, on EPA's webpage that it can be a problem if there's a significant amount of it because it can nitrify, and when it happens, it lowers oxygen levels and biofilm growth can happen. And the thing I added here about high ammonia is harmful to fish. I know we have a high ammonia aquifer here in Illinois where the state was considering putting a fish hatchery, but once they had done some water quality analysis on it, they decided they couldn't put it there because it would have not allowed them. They'd had to treat in order to have a fish hatchery. So, and the next question, how could mercury get into your well? You know, that's a really good question because everything that we found, and we'll research this a little further because we didn't have a lot of time to look into this, but mercury is usually in surface water, and it's from erosion of either natural deposits or it's from some human source, either runoff from a landfill or something like that. It really shouldn't be a well issue, as from my experience. And like I said, we'll look into this a little more to make sure, but it seems like if you have a mercury issue and you actually have sampled in it, you have mercury, that's probably a well integrity issue, but it's not something that we're really aware of. Any other thoughts on that?
Another source of mercury is just from the air, from like a coal fire boiler plant, power plant, but that would again be a surface water concern. But if you've got something similar to the pond near your well, that could possibly be a source.
Okay. Okay. So the next question, and we get this usually a lot. There's a lot of places in the country where you have this sulfur or rotten egg smell, and so you know, our water tested safe, but it smells like rotten eggs. So why does it smell that way, and how can we treat it? So first of all, this is a natural process due to sulfate reduction in a well, and so that's why it's so common. It's just in the ground. There's a lot of sulfate and sulfate reducing bacteria, which there we go. And so I'll let Chuck and Dan talk about treatment options. I think there's a number that will work. I wanted to point out, and I know writing this down right now would be a pain, but two sources where there's already a lot of information are both that Purdue Extension has a website that lists a lot of information about hydrogen sulfide, and so does wellowner.org. What I would suggest is that you read these two web pages, and then if you have more questions or you need more advice, I would then call your local health department. So, guys?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Yeah, that's one of our most common questions. To treat it, it usually involves some type of oxidation which will oxidize the sulfides to sulfates. A lot of people will also kill off the sulfate-reducing bacteria. They'll try to keep that under control in their well by chlorinating or disinfecting their well. You can also, treat it at your house, like with things like aeration or some type of a chemical oxidation, like a oxidizing filter, like a manganese green sand filter, like an iron filter. I think I'm not really an expert on it, but I see references to activated carbon, but it seems like I usually see this as maybe being for smaller amounts. If you get too high, it might overwhelm it. Do you have any thoughts there, Chuck?
I agree with that. I think the carbon filter could get overwhelmed by it and need very frequent replacement. Another source could be your hot water heater, because sometimes you just smell it with the hot water. And there's I think it's a zinc corrosion rod, cathodic protection rod, to keep your water heater from not corroding, and that can react and cause that rotten egg smell. You can replace the rod with a aluminum one, but that may void your warranty for your hot water heater. So check with local health department on that and your warranty for your hot water heater.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
What are the natural contaminants that I should be testing for, basically? We talk about natural occurring contaminants like arsenic all the time, and they're things that are just there. I usually, when I give a presentation, mention that arsenic is the 7th most common element in the Earth's crust, so it's in a lot of places. In many states, there are wells with arsenic problems, and so we've just listed a few here. They're both nuisance and health-based contaminants. And so the nuisance ones aren't a health risk per se, but they can cause staining or taste or other issues. And the health-based contaminants are all set by US EPA. And even fluoride, which I listed here at the bottom, many communities, and fluoride's not that common in groundwater, but many communities add fluoride to their water as a dental preventative measure. It's been shown, I think, a number of times, and I'll talk about this more in another question in a minute, that it reduces cavities, plain and simple. But too much fluoride actually can be a health risk. So understanding all these issues, you don't want to have to sample for everything under the sun, so to speak, just because of the expense. And the folks at your local health department or your state resource agency, like your DNR or DEQ or all those folks, should have an idea of what naturally occurring contaminants are already in some of the aquifers in your area. And so again, it's about doing a little investigation, and I think I'm going to mention that here. Oh no, I want to show an example. Massachusetts DEP actually has a website, so you can go to the site, type in your address if you live in Massachusetts, and they already know where there's a lot of arsenic and uranium in private wells in the bedrock. And so you type in your address and it'll tell you whether you're more likely or not to have that risk, and if it's worth then you sampling your well for those things. So every state does things differently. Like I mentioned Rhode Island earlier, there's a map on their webpage that shows just this big splotch of pink or purple, and if you're in that area, they recommend you test for beryllium. And so it's, doing a little investigation is really the key, so that you don't have to spend a lot of extra money on sampling. I know we talk about arsenic being common, but talking to some of the state regulatory agencies, I've had a number of them tell me, oh, well, we don't have arsenic in our state. We don't have any communities that are dealing with it. And so it's not everywhere. And so it's better to know in advance, and your resources agency probably has a handle on that if it's not available online. So So then once you have an idea of both the nuisance and health-based contaminants, go again back to your health department and ask them, is this what I should sample for? Do you have any other ideas of things that other people in the area might have had? And they'll probably say, well, is your well near a feedlot or near a field or whatever? Anything else that might be a risk? If it's near some kind of certain type of business or factory, maybe you want to sample for this. So ask someone who, it's their job to understand the health risks from drinking water. So, yeah. Next question. I have a deep limestone well that tastes fine, but has fine limestone silt that requires a filter. What should I be testing for? Well, this question, I reworded it a little bit. So I wasn't quite sure if the person who asked it actually had their water tested or not, because I thought they were really saying that it just tastes fine. And so, taste doesn't matter as far as whether it's got any health risks or not. And so I would follow all the recommendations we brought up before about getting your water tested and talk to your health department. Limestone itself obviously isn't a problem, and it's actually good that you have a filter. It's unfortunate, but it's actually good you have a filter, because that stuff builds up and it gets in your, in your tank in your toilet, and just can clog up pipes in your pressure tank and everything else. And so it's probably, like I said here, it's just a fact of life that you have some of that fine limestone coming up. And if it's the only other suggestion, which I didn't think about till just now, is sometimes when you have your pump set at a certain spot, it may be allowing some of that silt or fine material to come up through your pump or your intake. And if you raise or lower your well or your intake, even 10 feet, it may, not necessarily, but it might change the situation and eliminate the problem. If your filters aren't that expensive and your water quality is good the way it is, I probably wouldn't go to that trouble or expense to move it, because again, it may not work, but it is another option.
I would think that you would have a high hardness water with limestone silt. That would be something just to be aware of, but also I would change the filter and observe the filter fairly often, because I think that if there was any bacteria in your system, that filter and the silt would be a great breeding ground. And you could, just to test for bacteria and to physically look at your filter when you change it, and see what it looks like.
Great, thanks. Oh, what did I do? There we go. How do I keep iron bacteria under control? This is an answer from Chuck and Dan, but from what we've seen, the typical approach is chlorine, and that does work. The person who asked this question said, I've used chlorine in the past. I think they were getting at, well, why do I have to keep repeating it? Well, we look for coliform bacteria as an indicator of surface influence, but there are many types of bacteria. We talked about sulfate-reducing bacteria. There's iron-reducing bacteria. There's methanogenic bacteria that are, sort of just there in the aquifer, even at depth. So, they're ubiquitous, so to speak, in groundwater. And there's no getting away from those. We have a case here in Illinois where we see sulfate-reducing bacteria in an aquifer they're reducing conditions, and at some point the bacteria get rid of all the sulfate in some of the wells in that area, and then the bacteria change to methanogenic bacteria because there's no sulfate anymore for the sulfur-reducing bacteria, so a different colony takes over, and it's just a natural process. So that's always going to happen because groundwater moves. It's a hydrologic cycle. Water is always flowing in an aquifer through all the either the cracks and fissures in rock or through between all the sand and gravel grains in a sand and gravel aquifer. So, it discharges to a low spot, usually a stream or a lake and all those things. So because water is moving, it's going to be carrying, even if you chlorinated your well and, the area right around your well has been treated, so to speak, at some point down the road, all that water is moving off and new water is taking its place, and you're going to have bacteria again. And so it's just going to be a continual issue.
You may need to consider physically cleaning your well, because sometimes there can be a slime layer. Bacteria can form this slime layer where just a single chlorination may not penetrate that. And so you may have to go that extra step of cleaning your system, and you also may have to go to a continuous feed of low levels of chlorine.
Yeah, continuous chlorinator may be an initial investment, but that's what community water has. It's chlorinated. It has to be residual in the distribution system all the way to everyone's homes, and that's for that reason. And so, in some ways, having an inline chlorinator is just not a bad idea. It protects you from other kinds of bacteria and from E. coli, and it makes your water more like the protection that a community water supply would provide. I was told to put chlorine bleach into the well once or twice a year to kill bacteria. Is this safe? Pouring chlorine bleach straight into a well is actually a really bad idea. Really, you should only disinfect your well when you need to, if it has a contamination problem. And, straight bleach can be harmful to some of the, especially if there's any kind of rubber seals and those sorts of things on your pitless. It's just not a great idea. Plus, when you pour chlorine into a well, let me step back. When you actually disinfect your well, you're ensuring that you're running water with a certain amount of chlorine through all the lines in your house and everything else at the same time, so that you're killing all the bacteria. If you're just pouring some down your well, you're not sure. Some of those faucets you may not even use for weeks. The chlorine's gone by then, so it really hasn't done its job. And there are recommendations for how to disinfect your well, and there's a lot of different ones from different states. We recommend using what the Minnesota Department of Health recommends, and we actually list that on our resources page on privatewellclass.org. It's very thorough. It walks you through what you need to do if you're going to disinfect your well, if you've had a problem. It has a little table that shows you how you should mix it, so that you're mixing chlorine with water so that you're at the correct amount of chlorine, that it's going to do the job, but it's not going to be as harmful. And so it's really probably isn't doing what people think it would do by pouring bleach down your well. And again, there's no reason to disinfect your well unless you have an issue. I guess Chuck or Dan, anything to add there? Sorry about that.
No, unless you have something, Chuck.
No.
Okay. I guess I knew that. So my dentist gave me a prescription for fluoride because we have a well. Do they really need this? Well, there's no doubt as far as a health, our society understands that it's a fact that fluoride prevents cavities. I was just at a meeting in August where someone from Arkansas Department of Health spoke about fluoride, because there's kind of an anti-fluoridation movement with community water supplies. But in Arkansas, they started fluoridation in some of the community water supplies in the 50s, and they've seen a dramatic drop in the number of cavities because of that. So there is some controversy. It's a personal decision, but that's why communities add it to their water in some cases. Now, I would always have your well tested first, and I'm assuming that this dentist understands that the community water probably is fluoridated, and so the private wells probably aren't. and so it's likely that they would need to have fluoride added, but you should always test. Just because if you happen to have fluoride already in your well, there's a health limit for it, and more than that is actually has adverse health effects. And fluoride is one of those things, as I said here, you need just a little, but more and that's bad. On the other hand, you certainly should trust your dentist if they recommend you add fluoride. You should either make sure you're getting it from your well, or you should take the prescription and provide it. And that's my opinion. So anything there, guys?
No, it's pretty thorough answer, Steve. Around here in a lot of Illinois, it's usually around 0.2 or 0.3, or maybe less than a half part per million, and I think that the municipalities add it to somewhere between 0.7 and 1.2 parts per million. So they do add a little bit, but we have seen, a few times we've seen fluoride up around 2 and 4 parts per million, which are the secondary and primary maximum contaminant levels. I think nationally there's a whoever makes the regulation is recommending now to lower the limit. Instead of having the recommended level be 0.7 to 1.2, I think they're just saying now just 0.7. So there is a slight reduction in the recommendation. Thanks.
Yeah, that actually came up at this meeting I was at. It was a small systems workshop for community water supplies that EPA held, and they have dropped it to just 0.7. Or that's the plan, and part of it is this controversy that there's a grassroots movement to that suggests you don't need any fluoride, and getting it in your water doesn't necessarily help. But like I said, there's overwhelming data that shows adding fluoridation to community water supplies has dramatically reduced cavities in those communities. So, okay.
Yeah, can I support you there too, Steve?
Sure.
The same, if you read like some of the statements the CDC puts out and some other health organizations, they really, I know there's a controversy, but they do, I've seen references to calling it one of the great health discoveries or evolutions in the last 50 years, the improvements we've seen in dental health because of the fluoridation. So there's a lot of strongly backed government agencies that will support at least some fluoridation.
Great. If I continue to have a bacteria problem, even after repeated chlorination, what can I do? Well, first of all, I'd be certain that it's not because of a breach with your well, or your well's shallow and you have a septic issue, or there's a feedlot nearby. Honestly, we've went to sample private wells here in Illinois where I've asked them, where's your well? And they point out to their barn, right next to their barn, where there's a feedlot that, not a pasture, a feedlot that's all mud because there's so many cattle in it. And their well's right in the middle, and it's a shallow, hand-dug well. So having an understanding of those things and what a bad idea that is important. But if it can't be controlled, and so I said here, it might require moving one or the other, meaning you either need to move your well or move your septic or move your feedlot so that there's more distance between. But the other option is to add an inline chlorinator, and that's certainly necessary in some areas. And I put here New York example. I was in New York this summer working with some private well owners, and it's all shallow bedrock right at the surface. And in some of these areas, there are probably 7 or 8 houses per mile on a certain stretch of road, because it's kind of on the outskirts of a larger city, but it's still in the country, but it's, it's more developed and becoming more developed. Well, all these homes have wells and septic, and it's shallow bedrock with so things can infiltrate in very quickly. Things move through the fissures and fractures quickly. And so they're starting to find a lot of E. coli contamination, which is what you'd expect. And so really those folks need to consider annexing onto a community water supply so that their water isn't coming from right where their septic is, so to speak. But in the short term, if that can't happen, then an inline chlorinator really is the only solution. They need to have continuous chlorination because there's no chance that disinfecting the well is going to prevent a reoccurrence of bacteria or E. coli. It's just going to keep happening. And so an online chlorinator or an inline chlorinator basically means that your water's always got some chlorine residual and it's killing that bacteria and doing what you need to do to be safe.
Just wanted to add that the tests for chlorine are just really simple, like you would use on I guess, do fish tanks have them?
You might
or
use it
if
you're starting it. Yeah, they probably do.
So you can pick them up anywhere. They're easy to use, and if you're doing online chlorination, you really need to monitor it, that you're not putting in too much, and to see that you're actually delivering some residual chlorine to the end of your pipe.
Yeah, and wherever you buy your chlorinator from, I would ask around before you buy any kind of treatment equipment and make sure that you use a vendor that most people are happy with and they provide good service and they're willing to help and not just sell you equipment and walk away. So they should have some advice on that stuff too. Do you recommend home testing kits? Well, from my experience, I've not really looked at any of these kits too much, and I realize 20 years ago there were kits available then and they didn't work at all, and I'm sure they've gotten better over this time, but I'd only use them really as a screening tool if you're looking for a specific thing. And I guess I put thoughts here because I was going to pass this one off to you guys.
Sure. I think a lot of times you'll get some kits that work out well, especially if they're simpler kits, like pH and chlorine are pretty easy, and if they're commonly used, they've been well established. We've done, just for some demonstrations, we've done some tests between sometimes nitrate or phosphate kits. They've been off by more than we really feel comfortable with, but they're still roughly okay. But it's not something I would trust if I would use it to monitor, like you said, to see if there's a major problem. If you're testing like for hardness, it's going to show a general hardness value. It's going to tell you if your water's hard or soft. That's probably pretty good. But if you're looking to, like if you were to test your hot tub for chlorine, you put a dipstick in it and it'd turn purple or something. That's a pretty good indication that something's there. Any other additions, Chuck?
Just that, and I think you've made this case, is that you've got to get your water tested by a professional lab, and then if there's something that is a problem, let's say you add high iron, but you did a treatment and the iron was reduced. Well, you might want to monitor something like iron just to see, okay, what does it read right now, and then monitor it to see, oh, it looks like it's getting worse. Then to take some action or to get another test to get a really good value.
Are we still on, Steve?
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Sorry about that. And I do know, like our local county soil and water conservation district, who works with private well owners, they have a test kit that they've vetted pretty much, and they feel it's fairly a good indicator for some things, and so they recommend that for some of the basic testing. But then their recommendation again is to, if the screening shows something, then you should go to a lab and have it quantified better. You use it for more of a presence-absence type of thing, or and then go from there as a starting point, because they are certainly generally cheaper, but not always. Okay, next question. Where and how can you get your water thoroughly tested for safe consumption? So I'm assuming by thoroughly, you mean you want to do the entire suite of contaminants that EPA lists. Just so you're aware, if you go to the EPA's drinking water page and look at the MCLs, which are the maximum contaminant levels for the primary and secondary drinking water standards, it's a big list, and it would be thousands of dollars. Your state regulatory agency will have a list of labs that are approved for testing for communities, which have to test for many of those things to make sure that the water they're providing is safe. I would use them. So either your state agency or even call a nearby community that has a water system, because they probably use a lab unless they're really big and they have their own lab, and ask them where they get their samples tested. That's how I would go about it.
And Steve, one of the things you had mentioned before goes along with this. You'd mentioned like looking for local issues. I agree. It would cost a lot of money, especially a lot of the organic testing. It can be more difficult, and it can really be cost prohibitive for a private well owner. So it's probably in your best interest to look for something that's cheaper to test for. Some of the things before, there was a question about what should I test for naturally. There's some of the points were made about coliforms being a good tracer. Some other things you can look for are like total dissolved solids. Be a good indication, like if you've got a lot of salt or things like that coming in. pH is a good overall test, and those kind of things should be fairly cheap wherever you go. If you get into a lot of say fuels or pesticides, those can be much more expensive. So it's a good idea to look for known local issues.
Yeah, certainly. And also even the type of aquifer you're in. If you're in a sand and gravel aquifer, there are things you're not going to find that you might have in a bedrock aquifer. So, it's do a little investigation first and determine, if you're out in the middle of nowhere, then there's certain industrial chemicals where, there's really no way they could have gotten in your area to cause a problem. So, and that's just to save you some money. And I wanted to approach this question this way because, if money's no object and you really want to be sure, there are a lot of things you can test for, but a lot of them are, industrial chemicals and things like that are going to come up negative. How do I know if my well is contaminated by oil, gas wells, or surface contamination? Well, if you're a new well owner or your well is new and you have no idea what the water quality is there, you've never sampled it before, then, I would just follow the guidelines we provided today. And it kind of goes back to the last question. There must be oil and gas wells in your area, but, there's a lot of fear about these, and most of the time, most folks who are putting those things in are doing things the right way. It's those that don't, or that don't properly maintain those wells, that cause the problem. And, as I said here, it's a process of elimination. You should understand that your well, is it properly constructed, and all those things first. And if you should understand what naturally occurring contaminants there are, what's being stored nearby, what the land use was prior to you living there. Maybe it was, who knows? Worst case, maybe there was a refinery nearby and it's closed and it's been gone, but now they redeveloped the land. I mean, you need to really investigate and understand the situation. I mean, it's a very open-ended question. As far as surface contamination, is it sandy soil? We have areas around the country where there's shallow wells and it's almost straight sand at the surface. Any kind of contaminant that gets on the ground is likely to make its way into the water table in those cases. So they're much more of a risk for, in an agricultural area for nitrate or pesticides, or, if you're, for instance, again, in Rhode Island, they list all these areas where there used to be orchards because, back in before the 70s or 80s, they used arsenic as a pesticide. And so now there's a lot of arsenic contamination around those old orchards. So it's understanding those things. It's not a great answer, I realize, but your question is pretty open-ended and it depends on a lot of factors. So I would go to your health department and ask them what they think too. Okay. And I'm going to try to go ahead.
Let me say something. Your well water is going to be very stable. You're not going to expect it to change every month, every 6 months, every year, every 5 years. It's basically the same water, and it's not going to change. So if you are particularly concerned about contamination from somewhere, I would say pH and total dissolved solids would be two tests that if you see a drastic change in those, you can then say, whoa, something's happening. And those are fairly simple tests to perform.
Yeah, and I think I forgot to mention that when I was showing things that we recommend sampling for. That list that said every 3 to 5 years, a lot of those things were just for what Chuck just said. In an aquifer, the mineralogy and stuff of the groundwater is usually based on the matrix of the material or the soil, if you will, that make up the aquifer. And so it's very consistent. So even though water's flowing slowly through the aquifer to a point of discharge, it's very similar in character. So for instance, if you have arsenic and it's 40 ppb, you would expect in 2 years it's going to be nearly the same. It may be 50, it may be 30, but you're going to have some. And so understanding that, and that's why you should sample for more things every 3 to 5 years, just because if there's some drastic change, then something has changed with your well, because or there's been contamination in the aquifer somewhere else that's made its way to you. Otherwise, it won't happen. Right, thanks, Chuck. Okay, so what are the pros and cons of city water versus well water? Well, I'm going to tell you about city water. It's tested to make sure it meets all the US EPA Safe Drinking Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act regulations. Missed a word there. It's treated, and it usually has a chlorine residual, and that's and what that means is residual means that they treat it with chlorine at the plant, it goes out in the distribution system, and there's still a little chlorine left in it when it gets to your tap. And that's to protect it from bacteria. It may have fluoride added, as we talked about earlier, and it's all a closed system, so all the way to your tap. The wells, the treatment system, all the infrastructure, they're inspected by a regulatory authority every 3 years to ensure that things are done correctly, they're compliant, that there aren't any deficiencies per se. And there's a lot of rules that govern how a community water supply can purvey water to all its citizens. And that's why you pay, like I pay a water bill. It's the combined cost to have all those things happen. So as a well owner, none of those things are done for you. You need to do them yourself. And I mean, in some states, when the well's installed, there are regulations, like there are in Illinois, that you have the well tested for coliform nitrate. I know I was just in North Carolina. There, they test for coliform nitrate and arsenic, I believe. And every state's a little different. But that's when the well's installed. So the driller's collecting a sample, or they may have 30 days from the time the well's installed. After that, it's all yours. And so that's the cost you have, and that's why we talk about protecting your investment and why you should sample, all those things, because you're really the water operator for a very small system, and it's your responsibility to make sure those things happen. Okay.
Good answer, Steve.
All right, thanks. You have something to add?
No, it's very good.
Okay, cool. So is sampling a well voluntary, and what are the laws governing private wells? So going back, there's a lot of misconceptions about private wells. There are a couple counties, and I mean just small counties, in I believe in 1 or 2 states where they've passed a law that requires you to test and meet all the Safe Drinking Water Act requirements. I don't know a lot about those counties. I need to find out more. And in some states, like New Jersey, I mentioned earlier, when you sell a property, the buyer and the seller have to agree who's going to pay the $600 fee to have the state come out and collect a water quality sample, and they test for a lot of things. The advantage of that, I'm a groundwater hydrologist, and I do research looking at water quality in wells and aquifers in Illinois. I'd love to have 13,000 samples a year in Illinois that are research quality, so to speak, so that we would understand the water quality of our state better. That's what they have in New Jersey. But if you have an existing well and you live there, and then your testing is completely voluntary, and it's totally up to you. No one can make you use your well or not use your well. They may recommend it. I know in Florida there are cases where they've had their state DEP may come in and say that there's some kind of industrial contamination that's contaminated aquifer. Well, they'll go in those areas and actually put in city water for people. And that's the one case where maybe you don't want to, but they're doing it because you really should. Even though you think your water might be better, it's at much more of a risk, and it's for your well-being and everyone else's. And there's a philosophy there that we won't get into. But the bottom line is, you can go to your county health department with sampling results that say, I have arsenic at 250 ppb, and the public health standard, or the EPA's Safe Drinking Water Act standard, is 10 ppb for a community water supply. So you have arsenic at 25 times what the EPA recommends for being safe to drink. They will tell you it's a bad idea to drink it. They will recommend that you add treatment or retest to make sure it's there and all those things. But in the end, if you want to drink that water, you can. So the thing here at the bottom is what I want to really hit home with here. My job in running this program, or being part of this program, is to help you understand why you should want to voluntarily test your well. It protects you and your family from possible health risks, and that's that's the reason we're here. So it is important. A lot of people think their water's safe. Quickly, I know we're running over today. My dad always swore that our well water was better than any city water because it didn't have chemicals in it. Plain and simple, that's the way he looked at it. He looked at it wrong. And we even had frogs in our well at one time because some bricks had gave way. So it's all perception. And in the end, our job and our message is you need to understand that there are risks. And the reason why communities continually test their water is because things can change that you have no control over or may not understand. And even though groundwater in many cases is very safe, it's very good water, it tastes great, it's got good mineralogy, all those things can happen that you don't understand or aren't aware of, and you need to protect yourself and be safe. And it's preventative, if nothing else. Okay. Quickly about the private well class, if you're not aware of our class, and I'm sure most of you are, it's 10 lessons, it's self-paced. If you go to privatewellclass.org, you can sign up. It sends you one lesson a week for 10 weeks. It's much more thorough than what we went through today. It talks about a lot of issues. This is the front page. You just click on enroll here. It only asks you for your first name, your email address, and what state you're in. And that's really so that we can tell EPA, yes, people from all over the country are taking our class, and we can show them the number of folks that are actually getting some benefit out of this. You can see here there's an email address, info@privatewellclass.org, and there's a phone number that we, while we're here during the day, 8 to 5, Monday through Friday, here at the University of Illinois, we answer. And there's also, you can leave a message, but we're here to support well owners, and that's the idea behind this class. There's a webinar page. This webinar that we're doing right now is being recorded, and it will be on the site. We did a webinar in Spanish, which shows up here at the bottom back in July. So you can always come back and watch these webinars and get information that way. Just for instance, the webinar we did last month was all about questions. We did it in September, actually. And one of the questions we got then was about disinfection, how to disinfect your well. So we showed a couple of the pictures from the Minnesota disinfection manual, and recommend where people can get that information, stuff like that. So the one thing about our class is for every lesson there's a set of resources that come from other organizations and experts around the country. These are all free and publicly available. You click on any one of them, it downloads a PDF or a Word file. And the whole point of all that, is we're trying to raise awareness, why your well is important, why you need to understand how it works, and how you can protect yourself from risk. And we think the class does a pretty good job of at least getting you started there. So we're going to take a few-minute break. Jennifer and Katie have been collecting questions you've been asking while we're going here. Actually, because we're so late, we probably should just keep going. So they've been putting questions in a Google Doc that we can all share. And so I'm going to pull that up and move it over here. And we'll get to these other questions. So Dan and Chuck, feel free to step in if you, yeah. Okay, so we'll just go, is a dug well also called a pit well? Actually, no. Some people may call it that, but a pit is actually almost like a cave, if you will, or a subterranean or buried well house. The idea being you dig a pit below the frost line and you put your well in there and have it capped below the frost line so you can run pipe into your house and it won't freeze in the winter. So they've developed a device called a pitless adapter, a pitless unit, that actually does that for you. Okay, it looks like I'm looking at the wrong questions. Interesting. Well, hang on one second then. We are going to take a 1 or 2 minute break while I figure this out. So I pulled up the wrong set of questions. I sure did. Okay, we've got that straightened out thanks to Jennifer and Katie. So I was looking at the wrong set, I guess. And I'm my own worst enemy sometimes. I apologize. That's the button I meant to hit. Okay, so are there any best practices for caring for a well during a drought? You know, sometimes it really depends on the well type. Sometimes you can do things, sometimes you can't. We've created some videos that aren't up on the website yet, but they will be, dealing with some of these issues, flooding and drought, and I just reviewed this a few weeks ago. So, you know, if you have a shallow well that's using like a dug or bored well that's from the water table, using the water table, then if you are in a sustained drought and the water table drops below your well, there's probably nothing you can do because, you know, the water table is below that. It's not saturated ground above it. And so you have to dig a deeper well or do something different. It could be in the first, you know, the best thing you can do is just conserve water. And some people haul water to their dug or bored well or to a cistern to conserve in that respect too. But as far as best practices, usually it's an issue of when you, it would just be conservation because there's no way other than limiting your water use that you could do too much to make a difference there. If you do lose water in your well, then there's two things that may have happened. One is the water may have dropped below the bottom of the well, and in that case, your well is really not usable. But if it could be that your pump is set or your intake for your pump is set at some point that there's still water in the well, but your intake is now out of the water. And in those cases, you could certainly lower your pump or your intake to take advantage of the water that's still in the well. And we see that even out in California and some of those areas where the first step when a well isn't producing water, or maybe it runs for 20 minutes and then stops because after 20 minutes the drawdown in the well gets to the intake, and so it starts pumping air and loses prime and all those things. So it's understanding what the depth of your water is, where your pump's set, and how deep your well is in total. That will at least give you some idea of what's going on. I know measuring water levels isn't a simple thing. Even for us, we measure a lot of water levels in private wells, but you know, in a few states like in Oregon, they actually, new well construction includes putting in small piezometer tubes so you can measure water levels just because of some of these issues. So not a great answer, But you know, yeah, really, it's just conservation. And in the case of California, we've had a lot of well owners call us where their wells have gone dry and they're waiting 6 months or 9 months to get a new well just because the drillers are so busy, and it's just an unfortunate situation. So my definition of a shallow well, well, when I usually talk about shallow wells, I usually mean large diameter wells, but it isn't necessarily that. So a large diameter well is either dug or bored, and usually put those in an area where there's no real, quote, good aquifer. And so you're putting in the shallow, large diameter hole that acts kind of like a cistern, and that water can seep in slowly, and it stores it so that when you need water, you've got this 3 or 4 foot diameter hole with maybe 10 or 20 feet of water in it, and so you've got that volume to use before you run out of water. And like I said, those usually go in an area where there isn't quote, a real aquifer, either bedrock or sand and gravel that you could put a well in. You know, shallow is up to is the eye of the beholder, so to speak. In some areas of the country, a 200-foot well may be shallow versus, you know, in an alluvial aquifer, which is an aquifer along a river, the water table may be 4 feet, and you may have people with sand points, which are just driven in screens with pipe. Because it's so shallow, they can keep the pump on the surface and those things. And I think it really depends on where you're at and your geology, and you know, the closer to the surface your well is, the more susceptible it would be to contamination. And that's when we talk about shallow wells, it's really about how possible is surface influence to contaminating your well. Okay, that's, again, not a great answer, but yeah. What can you do if nitrates are found in the well, and when is the best time of year to take a sample? The nitrate, we did a study where we looked at a lot of dug and bored wells in Illinois, and we sampled quarterly, and then in some of those we sampled every month. And you would think that nitrate values would follow some sort of cycle in an agricultural area in a shallow well. But we found that they didn't. And so they did vary. And so I don't know that there's a best time of the year to sample. If you sample and you have nitrates, I would suggest resampling. Just a nitrate test itself isn't very expensive. And to get an idea of how much it changes or if you're close to the limit. Again, with nitrates, as far as health concerns, the main one is for pregnant women and babies. And for those of us that, yeah, it's not as much of a risk for us, and I'm not a health professional, I'll caveat that, and you might want to talk to your health agency. But Chuck and Dan, anything to say there?
Oh, you might follow up with a coliform test. You know, like you mentioned earlier, the coliforms and nitrates can be an indicator of surface contamination. As far as what to do about them, probably the reverse osmosis is going to be the best answer, aside from trying to find the source and remedying the source.
Well, the next question's for you guys too. Does a reverse osmosis system filter out a lot of bad contaminants?
Reverse osmosis is pretty good at filtering out a lot of stuff. I don't remember the exact size of the holes, but it's really small. It technically will filter out, you know, most inorganics. Maybe I'm not really sure about like liquid organics or volatile organic chemicals. Viruses and bacteria it would filter out. I don't think it's generally recommended for those because they can grow on the membrane, or if it gets past it, it can actually colonize on the other side of the membrane. But they are a pretty good system for most things. Now there's some caveats here. Things like arsenic, where you'd really like it to take them out, I think they found mixed effectiveness. So you might have to pre-treat the water with. It seems like I've read that they've had better effectiveness if they oxidize the arsenic from arsenite to arsenate, different type of arsenic, and to make it more effective for RO units. But in general, they are pretty good.
Yeah, an RO unit will remove, gosh, 95 to 98% or more of the TDS, the dissolved minerals that are in the water. So it's going to make the water very, very, very pure. And so as a result of that, contaminants are taken out. This RO water is very corrosive, and so they typically use plastic pipe because it's unnatural, because it's taken out all the minerals, so it is corrosive.
And one more thing, it is typically a point of use filter as opposed to a whole house filter, just because it does waste a lot of water, and it wouldn't be practical, I don't think, to put in a whole house RO unit.
Great. The next question is, are septic system additives necessary? Well, I recommend you watch the video that we have from our webinar on septic systems. This is a huge issue. When we first brought this up in our webinar and said, no, they're not, they really don't do anything, I was inundated with emails from folks who said, oh, I know it makes my system work better and all these things. We've looked into it with a lot of research that's been done, talked to septic installers, and it really, if you maintain your system the way it's supposed to be, and you have it pumped regularly like you should, which is depending probably every 3 to 5 years, the system's meant to work with all the natural bacteria from our bodies, and it works well. It's a great simple system, and you can, I had someone tell me, well, we've added yeast for years and we've never had to pump it. Well, I guarantee you your tank is actually pretty full of solids, because adding that yeast isn't going to do anything. And I know there's been other things that have come out that are more, quote, scientifically supposed to be better, but they're not necessary. And that's the conclusion we've come to looking at a lot of different sources. So what was our organization you mentioned as a resource for knowing how frequently to pump your septic tank? That's the National Environmental Services Center at West Virginia University. And if you just Google National Environmental Services Center, they'll come up. And if you go to their search box and say septic, they have a ton of resources. And the other place you can look, again, the webinar that's on our webinars page on septic systems, we go into a lot more detail and provide that link and show their front page for their septic stuff and all that. So they're certainly a good resource. They're a clearinghouse of information on both private well, septic, and community water and wastewater systems. So there's a lot of good stuff there. The next question, does rain replenish well water? It certainly does. And how quickly that happens and how quickly you'll see a response to a rainfall really depends on the situation. As an example, if you have a shallow well in a sandy soil, we have an area in Illinois along the Illinois River where I manage a network of monitoring wells just to look at water levels and how they change. And we know in some of that area, the water levels in the wells may only be 4 or 5 feet below land surface, and in other parts of that area, they're 40 or 50 feet. And we've done enough work there. We've had these wells in place for 20 years that we see the aquifer bounce, if you will, up as much as half a foot after a several-inch rainfall in the lower end of that area where the water levels are near the surface. And it may take 3 or 4 inches of rainfall over a week to see even a blip in the water level change where the depth of water is 40 feet. And that's because the water's got to go through 40 feet of unsaturated sand versus just a few feet. As the geology gets more complicated, like where I live here, the same aquifer, as I was just talking about, has 100 feet of clay and silt over top of it. We only see maybe a 1/4 inch of recharge a year to that aquifer versus in the sandy area, 12 inches of recharge a year. And that's because the water's got to go through all this tight clay material, and it takes it a long time. We date well water and groundwater based on tritium analysis and some other things, And we know in some aquifers that the water is 10,000 years old or even older. In other areas, the water is less than 50 years old because it has tritium in it. And from that, we know that there's more more recent recharge. So that's really a question that, I need to see the geology of where your well is and if you have a screen, where your water's coming from. But in general, the hydrologic cycle, it rains, it infiltrates in, it gets into an aquifer, it eventually discharges to a river or stream or the ocean, it evaporates, and it starts all over again. And, a question like this, the best thing you can do, in all honesty, is to take our class. The first couple lessons are all about how water gets in your well, the hydrologic cycle, and all those things, and it's really worth your time. So the next question, is a landlord renting out a property obligated to chlorinate the well? I would say that's probably depends on where you live, in what state or area you're from. But what I would do is I would have a water sample collected for your own benefit. My son actually rents a house. I went and collected a sample myself and found out that their water's fine. If their water wouldn't have been fine, and it is a bored well, I would have went to his landlord and told him he's going to do something about it. And there's a lot of issues there. Whether I really could have done anything about it or not, I don't know. Whether they have an obligation, as a good landlord, you'd think they would, but I would first get a sample, make sure your water isn't safe, and if it's not, then go to your county health department and find out what you might be able to do or what they might be able to do. And it may just mean a phone call from the county health department saying, we have this issue, you're renting your property, it makes you a for-profit business. I don't, like I said, I don't know that it'll make a difference. Yeah, that's not something that we've really dealt with. So, okay, one more question it looks like. So on water, is it true that we still have the same amount of water on Earth at all times, that it doesn't matter if it's a drought someplace on the face of the Earth? Technically, yes. One of the things we tell kids when we go to schools and teach them about groundwater and wells and the water cycle is that, the water you're drinking today, that molecule water may have been through the hydrologic cycle 50 times or 5 times, and it may have been drank by a dinosaur. And that's because it's always moving. It's a interconnected cycle, and in some places, water may seep in the ground and stay there for 50,000 years, but eventually other water comes in to push it out. It makes its way back to the surface, and it starts the process all over again. And so, in theory, yeah, there's the same amount of water. And from my perspective, yeah, I'd probably need to research that a little bit to be sure that, the Earth, quote, isn't losing water somewhere to space or whatever, but I don't think so. So, okay, well, with that, I think we're going to call it good for today. We went over by quite a bit. I apologize for that. We had a lot of folks on today, and that's terrific. If you have any more questions, you can email us at info@privatewellclass.org. Thanks, Katie, Jennifer, Chuck, and Dan for your help today. And we plan to try to do at least one webinar a month from now on. And in some cases, we'll probably do more, so stay tuned for that. And there are other resources we're planning to put on our webpage. We're trying to move our page, and so we haven't done that yet. But videos for some of the lessons and podcasts and a lot of other materials. But again, I encourage you, if you haven't signed up for our class, it's free. It comes to you as a PDF once a week. You can read it on your own time, and it's pretty beneficial. So with that, I guess we're going to call it good. Thank you very much for attending.
Thanks, Steve.